I'll start with the question. Who here has had a normal life in the past 2 years? Not only have we felt the effects of the pandemic, but we've seen its impact on our IoT open source projects as well. Let's take a look. So the 2 pandemic years since 2020 have brought us supply chain issues, including a global chip shortage which has severely affected the Internet of Things. We've had problems filling positions in the industry, including in open source. And we can see the effect on our IoT open source projects as well. So when we look at the differences in this graph, we see that contributions to IoT open source projects increased until 2019, plateaued, and then have declined in the past 2 years. And we wonder about this. This might be a surprise to us because IoT continues to be strong, and demand for IoT solutions tends to be on the rise. So forecasts for the next 5 years point to a growing industry, yet we see a decline, possibly temporary, in contributions to IoT open source projects. And contributions are not the only aspect with issues. We see reductions in contributing organizations, active IoT open source repositories, and most importantly, the contributors that make it all possible. So when comparing the last 2 years with the previous years before that, we see a reduction in contributors with commits to IoT open source organizations by over 13%. Now, is this a sign of a labor shortage in open source Internet of Things? Is this a sign of maturity that we're finally moving overall from development to production? I'm speculating, and you all have stories to tell here. But I'll tell you what I do know. The open source Internet of Things is not going anywhere. We've seen 2 figures that show the impact of the pandemic on open source IoT with a concerning overall trend. But when we look at more indicators, we see that IoT open source projects are staying strong. Let's take a look at that data. To start, we grouped each project into a category. What we're doing here is checking for differences between different types of projects in the IoT open source landscape. And each category brings something unique to the table, and each IoT open source project fills a different piece of the puzzle. When we look at the different categories, we see that each one of them has anywhere from 1 to 13 projects in total. And when we group the projects like this into the different categories, they become easy to understand, measure, and observe. Now, let's look at the foundations that we are looking at for this data set that house a lot of these IoT open source projects. We specifically looked at the Linux Foundation, the Apache Software Foundation, the Eclipse Foundation, and the Fiware Foundation. And anything in the other category, any open source project there, is not affiliated with the foundation. So let's look at how those projects and those foundations and categories interact. So we see that each foundation has at least one category to call its own. When we're looking at this data, we also see that some foundations target larger communities, while others will focus on multiple smaller communities. So when we look at it, we see that each foundation seems to be following a specific niche in the IoT space. This means that there's very little redundancy, and the efforts are focused rather than duplicated. This is very encouraging to me. So let's also look at the companies and organizations that help support these foundations and the work behind them. When we look at the organizations and their contributions to the different foundations we see in IoT open source landscape, we see that each organization tends to pick a foundation and stick to it. This can create islands of contribution with little cross-collaboration between foundations, and this can be a problem. The heat map here shows darker spots for more contributions, and this highlights the silos between organizations and foundations. We can further explore this data by mapping it in a different way. We look at the top 45 contributing organizations, shown here as yellow squares, and the top 4 foundations, shown here as blue circles. So what we see here is that there's a serious lack of cross-collaboration, and this further highlights the silos. Now, we also see that open source IoT has a share of issues, especially in cross-collaboration, but we want to focus also on how open source IoT is doing in other ways too, maybe focus on a positive. So what we found in this data as well is that the presence of a foundation in the governance of an IoT open source project can help make it stronger. We've seen positive trends in projects that are supported by a foundation when they're in open source IoT. Let's dive into the data to better understand that. You see at the bottom here, we have a graph of the contributions to projects that are not supported by foundations in open source IoT. We can see that they were hit hard by lockdown, that they've had a severe impact from the pandemic, among other things. And then we see also at the top here, the projects with support from different foundations are still showing resilience and strength, even compared to the global IoT metrics. So this is just something that you may want to take home with you and think about when it comes to the foundation support of IoT open source projects. And speaking of projects, let's look at the different IoT open source projects that we have in our landscape of data. So I imagine that we're all at the Zephyr Developer Summit because we have a shared interest in the Zephyr project. So I'll highlight Zephyr specifically. This is not a coincidence. Judging by the number of commits, Zephyr is the most active IoT open source repository in our data right now. The other two top IoT open source repositories are Apache Camel and the NutX project. So when we move forward with this, we also see, as we looked at these projects that have developed and grown over the last 2 years, we've seen very little change in their ranking. And this is kind of an indication to us that the project work in these projects is mostly consistent. So let's highlight just the Zephyr project now, just because of where we are. So the Zephyr project is doing very well, as we know, and it's leading its category, which is OS and virtualization. We see that there are many organizations and companies that are interested in contributing to the Zephyr project. It's got a steady stream of commits, and we've seen a lot of considerable growth over the last 2 years. In fact, I've got a figure that may surprise you. When you look at the global IoT and the global IoT metrics and the information on the Git contributions to all the different IoT open source projects, you see that decline that we've talked about before. But when we look specifically just at the Zephyr project, we see a considerable increase in contributions over that same period of time. And in fact, we see no indication in this graph of negative impact on Zephyr the project from the pandemic. And if we can bring back the reduction in 13% of total authors with commits to IoT open source repositories, we can also see that the Zephyr project in its repository has grown in contributors by about 49%. Now that's pretty impressive to me, and I think a lot of people are becoming much more interested in contributing to the Zephyr project, and I'm guessing that's why y'all are here today. So that's our data, and as we close up the data, I'd like to mention that the analysis was accomplished using the open source GrimoireLab toolset, which is built from the Linux Foundation Chaos project for open source metrics. So GrimoireLab allowed us to collect all of this data and also analyze it from different perspectives. And I'd also like to thank Valerio and Alvaro because they laid the groundwork for this presentation. They presented at FLOSS in 2020, and we reused their dashboard setup and some of their project categorizations, but we added new data from the last 2 years in plenty of projects. So I just want to thank you too. We couldn't have done it without you. And if you're interested in learning more about your data, how you can improve your process or other aspects related to your contributions, please reach out to me, catch me during the break, anything like that. We've got a QR code up there that you can scan, or you can go to that link, and this is the dashboard that we use to capture all of this information. All that data is right there. So one last thing to share here today is that I am hopeful for the future, as it says here. So we see that there is a serious negative impact on IoT open source project contributions during the pandemic. But we continue to move forward. Some projects, such as the Zephyr project, have been able to grow, starting new initiatives, working on new projects, and seeing what sticks and what works for them. And I just wanted to say that I'm hopeful for the future of open source IoT and that we'll bounce back and become more successful than ever. And I'll have some questions for you to take home with you today. Not homework, I promise. But I just wanted to ask, so how can we foster cross-collaboration, allow for cross-innovation? How can we break these silos, and is that helpful, or is this just my ideological view of open source? So anyway, it looks like IoT open source is a promising future, and I'm looking forward to what comes next, and I hope you are too. Please catch me during the break, and I'm glad to talk about your data and if you think this made sense to you or anything could be improved. We've got a dashboard ready to look at.